Imagine walking into a bank, dressed professionally, confident, knowing exactly why you're there. But instead of being helped, you're met with indifference. The receptionist barely acknowledges you. The manager glances at you, then looks away. That's exactly what happened to Elena Carter. She walked into Westwood Bank expecting professionalism. Instead, she was forced to sit and wait. 5 minutes, 30, an hour. Meanwhile, other customers, some who arrived long after her, were greeted with smiles and ushered right in. Why? Because the bank manager, Gerald Whitman, had already decided she wasn't a priority. But here's where things get interesting. Gerald thought he was in control. He thought he could decide who mattered, until the doors of the bank swung open and Jonathan Reynolds, a senior executive from corporate, walked in. And the moment he saw Elena, everything changed. Gerald's smug confidence vanished. The bank staff fell silent. Because the woman they had ignored for 3 hours, she wasn't just any customer. She was someone they couldn't afford to overlook. This isn't just a story. It's a reality check about power, respect, and how quickly things can shift when the truth comes to light. And trust me, you don't want to miss how this ends. The sun hung high over Westwood City, drenching the streets in a golden haze. The concrete shimmered and the air smelled of pavement baked by the heat. People moved sluggishly, fanning themselves with newspapers, desperate for shade. Inside Westwood Bank, the atmosphere was different, cool, sterile, efficient. The hum of computers and distant phone conversations blended with the occasional click of heels against polished marble floors. Employees moved with routine precision, their expressions neutral, their smiles reserved for the right kind of customers. And then Elena Carter stepped through the glass doors. She wasn't flustered by the heat or the indifferent glances from the bank staff. She had spent a lifetime navigating spaces like this, where respect was conditional, where a tailored suit and perfect posture didn't always buy you the benefit of the doubt. Elena was in her early 40s, her skin a deep, warm brown that gleamed under the overhead lights. Her dark curls were pulled into a neat bun, and behind her glasses, her sharp eyes took in everything, the way the receptionist barely looked up, the way the bank manager's gaze flicked over her before returning to his screen. She adjusted her leather briefcase and approached the counter. The young woman behind the desk, Hannah, blinked up at her, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard. Good afternoon, ma'am. How can I help you?" "Good afternoon," Elena said smoothly. "I have a meeting with the branch manager regarding my account. Could you let him know I'm here?" Hannah glanced toward the glass-walled office at the far end of the bank. Inside, Gerald Whitman sat at his desk, flipping through a file, his expression unreadable. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his navy suit crisp. He looked like a man who had never hurried a day in his life. Hannah cleared her throat. "One moment, please." She picked up the phone, murmured something, then looked back up with an awkward smile. "You can take a seat. He'll be with you shortly." Elena nodded and turned toward the seating area. She chose a chair near the window where she could watch everything. The tellers, the customers, the way time moved for some and stood still for others. She crossed one leg over the other, her fingers tapping lightly on her briefcase. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Inside, the minutes stretched, slow and deliberate. She checked her watch. 5 minutes, 10, 15. Across the lobby, Gerald Whitman sipped his coffee and laughed at something a junior banker said. Elena inhaled deeply, pressing her lips together. It was going to be one of those days. The air inside Westwood Bank was crisp, the kind of artificial chill designed to make people forget about the world outside. But no amount of air conditioning could cool the slow burn rising in Elena Carter's chest. She had been waiting for 20 minutes now, then 30. The minute hand of the oversized clock on the wall dragged forward with agonizing indifference. She shifted in her seat, her polished heel clicking softly against the marble floor. Across the room, the receptionist, Hannah, avoided her gaze, keeping herself busy with nothing in particular, flipping through a folder, adjusting a stapler, anything to keep from meeting Elena's eyes. Elena exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had come here for a simple meeting, nothing more. But this was starting to feel familiar. The unspoken hierarchy, the selective urgency, the unspoken rules about who deserved efficiency and who was expected to wait. Just then, the glass doors swung open and a man in a grey suit stepped. Inside, middle-aged, slightly balding, carrying the unmistakable confidence of someone used to being served first. He barely glanced at Eleanor as he strode toward the counter. Hannah's demeanor shifted instantly. Her back straightened, her voice brightened. "Good afternoon, Mr. Peterson, right this way." Elena watched as Mr. Peterson was ushered past the waiting area, past the line of customers, past the growing tension in the air. Her fingers tightened around her briefcase. She turned her attention toward Gerald Whitman, the branch manager. His office was encased in glass, offering a perfect view of the lobby, of her. He saw her. He had seen her the moment she walked in. And yet, there he was, chatting with a junior banker, sipping his coffee like time didn't exist for him. Elena stood. Her heels clicked deliberately against the floor as she approached the reception desk. Hannah stiffened slightly, her polite mask slipping for just a fraction of a second. "Excuse me," Elena said, her tone calm but firm. "I've been waiting for quite some time. Mr. Whitman is aware of my appointment, correct?" Hannah's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She hesitated, casting a nervous glance toward the manager's office. Yes, ma'am. But we're a little busy today," she said, forcing a smile. "He'll be with you shortly." Elena followed her gaze toward Gerald. The man hadn't moved, hadn't even glanced her way. He wasn't busy. He was making her wait. A slow, knowing nod formed in Elena's mind before she even realized it. She returned to her seat, not because she had given up, but because she knew something Gerald Whitman didn't. She knew that power didn't always announce itself, and sometimes patience wasn't about waiting. Sometimes it was about watching. The clock on the bank's pristine white wall ticked forward, slow, deliberate, almost mocking. Elena Carter shifted in her seat, uncrossing and recrossing her legs, the leather of the chair sticking slightly to the back of her blazer. Her patience, refined over years of experience in rooms just like this, was beginning to fray at the edges. 45 minutes. She exhaled through her nose, tapping her fingers lightly against her briefcase. Around her, the bank moved like a well-oiled machine for everyone but her. A woman in high heels clicked past her and was immediately greeted with a handshake and a warm, "Right this way, Mrs. Calloway." A younger man in a college sweatshirt barely made it to the counter before he was helped. But Elena sat. She watched as Gerald Whitman, the man who could have ended this wait with a single nod, leaned back in his leather chair, scrolling through something on his phone, completely unbothered. She checked her watch. 1 hour. The air inside the bank was crisp, the artificial coolness contrasting the slow simmer rising inside her. She pulled out her phone, answering a few emails, pretending that this wasn't the insult that it was, that she wasn't sitting here, being ignored, deliberately made to wait. 2 hours. The bank's late afternoon crowd began to thin out. The tellers had fewer transactions, the noise of casual conversations died down, but still, Gerald Whitman remained unmoved. His office door never opened. His gaze never drifted toward her. Elena rolled her shoulders, inhaling deeply. Then finally she stood. The air shifted the moment she rose, a silent ripple of awareness. She smoothed the front of her blazer and walked, unhurried, to the reception desk. Hannah, The young receptionist swallowed hard as Eleanor approached. Eleanor's voice was steady, controlled. "I have now been waiting for 2 hours and 15 minutes. I would like to know why." Hannah's hands twitched over the keyboard as if typing would give her an escape. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, a voice cut in. "Ma'am, you'll have to wait until we can accommodate you." Eleanor turned. Gerald Whitman had finally decided to acknowledge her. He leaned in the doorway of his office, arms crossed, his tone dripping with forced politeness. Not apologetic, not accommodating, just dismissive. Elena held his gaze. She had met men like him before, men who carried their authority like a weapon, convinced that silence was a command, that patience was a sign of weakness. But he didn't know who he was making wait, and soon he would. The air inside Westwood Bank had changed. It was subtle, an invisible shift, like the crackling energy before a storm. Elena Carter stood tall at the reception desk, her expression composed but unwavering. Her patience had stretched thin, worn down by 2 hours and 15 minutes of deliberate disregard. And now, the man responsible for it, Gerald Whitman, finally decided to acknowledge her. He leaned in the doorway of his office, arms crossed, wearing the smug confidence of a man who believed he held all the power. His silver hair was slicked back, his navy suit impeccable, and yet there was something inherently careless about the way he looked at her. "Ma'am," he repeated, his voice carrying the false politeness of someone who thought he was doing her a favor. "You'll have to wait until we can accommodate you." Eleanor's lips pressed together, but she didn't look away. She had no intention of making a scene. She didn't need to. She knew how to make people uncomfortable without raising her voice. "I see," she said smoothly, adjusting the strap of her leather briefcase. "So, I just want to clarify. Customers who arrived after me have been helped. Appointments have been honored, but I'm still waiting. Why is that?" Hannah, the receptionist, stiffened in her seat. She kept her eyes glued to her computer screen, clearly wishing she could disappear. Gerald exhaled, slow and exaggerated, like he was dealing with a child. "As I said, we're very busy today." Elena tilted, her head slightly. "Busy?" Her eyes flicked toward his desk, where his half-empty coffee cup sat beside his untouched paperwork, where just minutes ago he had been laughing with a junior banker as if time had no meaning. Gerald followed her gaze and frowned. His fingers twitched against his forearm, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve as if that small movement could reclaim control of the moment. Elena smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Whitman. What exactly does accommodate mean to you? Because from where I'm standing, it seems to have a very selective definition." A flicker of irritation crossed his face. He wasn't used to being challenged. Not like this, not by someone like her. His voice dropped, his tone losing its pretense of politeness. "Look, ma'am, some clients are just a higher priority." There it was. The veil slipped, revealing what had been there all along. The words hung in the air, bold and unapologetic. He didn't even bother to mask it, because men like Gerald Whitman didn't think they had to. Elena inhaled slowly. She had a choice. She could react the way he expected her to, with frustration, with indignation, or she could do what she did best. She could watch him dig his own grave, so she simply nodded, "I understand." And then, with the same measured grace she had walked in with, she took her seat again. This time she wasn't just waiting, she was watching. Because what Gerald Whitman didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly predicted, was that the people who were about to walk through those glass doors would change everything. The clock's steady ticking filled the near-empty bank lobby. Elena Carter sat with her back straight, legs crossed, her fingers lightly drumming against her briefcase. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was calculating. Across the room, Gerald Whitman had retreated into his office, but not before throwing her one last dismissive glance. To him, the matter was settled. He had made his point. He had flexed his authority. He had reminded her, in the most subtle yet blatant way, that he controlled who mattered and who didn't in this space. Elena exhaled slowly, a small smirk touching the corner of her lips. He thought he had won. Outside the tall glass windows, the late afternoon sun cast long golden streaks onto the polished floor. The city moved in its usual rhythm, cars honking, hurried footsteps, distant chatter, but inside Westwood Bank, the tension sat heavy, thick, like an unseen fog. Elena checked her watch. 3 hours. 3 hours of watching him prioritize others. 3 hours of his smug indifference. She rose from her seat with quiet confidence, adjusting the lapels of her blazer before making her way toward Gerald's office. Her heels clicked against the marble, sharp, intentional, precise. The noise made Hannah, the receptionist, snap her gaze upward, wide-eyed. She looked like she wanted to intervene but didn't dare. Gerald, seated behind his desk, only acknowledged Elena when her shadow fell across his paperwork. He sighed, setting down his pen. "I thought I made myself clear, ma'am." Eleanor held up a hand, not aggressively, just enough to silence him without effort. "Mr. Whitman," she said evenly, "I believe I've been more than patient." Her voice carried through the quiet space, a controlled steadiness that turned heads. Even the tellers behind the counter glanced up, sensing the shift in the air. Gerald leaned back in his chair, one brow arching as if amused by her persistence. "Patience is a virtue," he said with a smirk. Elena met his gaze. "So is competence." The smirk twitched. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, the front doors of the bank swung open. The energy shifted instantly. A group of well-dressed executives strode inside, their presence undeniable. Their tailored suits, sharp expressions, and commanding strides made it clear they weren't customers, they were decision-makers. A hush fell over the room. Bank tellers straightened their postures. Employees whispered among themselves. Elena didn't turn around. She didn't have to, but Gerald did. And when his eyes landed on the one man leading the group, his smirk disappeared completely. The heavy glass doors of Westwood Bank swung open, and suddenly, the entire energy of the room shifted. It was like someone had turned down the volume on everything else. The hushed conversations, the rustling of paperwork, even the quiet hum of the air conditioning. A group of executives walked in, their presence undeniable. Their suits were crisp, their movements efficient. They weren't just here to make transactions, they were here to evaluate, to assess, to judge. And leading them was Jonathan Reynolds. Tall, with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, Reynolds wasn't just another suit. He was a senior director from the bank's corporate headquarters, and unlike Gerald Whitman, he wasn't the kind of man who ignored things. The second Gerald saw him, his expression changed. His body stiffened, his casual arrogance evaporating in an instant. Elena Carter, still standing in front of Gerald's desk, didn't have to look back to know what had just happened. She could feel it, the sudden shift of power. A slow, deliberate smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Something wrong, Mr. Whitman?" she asked smoothly, tilting her head ever so slightly. Gerald didn't answer. He was too busy standing up, too fast, too eager, too obvious. "Mr. Reynolds," Gerald said, his voice a little higher than before, "this is a surprise. We weren't expecting you." Jonathan Reynolds barely acknowledged him. His sharp eyes scanned the room. And then they landed on Eleanor. And, just like that, everything clicked into place. His expression immediately softened. "Ms. Carter," he said, striding forward and extending his hand, his voice filled with genuine warmth. "I apologize for any inconvenience. We didn't know you'd be here today." Eleanor took his hand, shaking it firmly. "No inconvenience at all," she replied, her tone light but pointed. Gerald blinked. His gaze flicked between Eleanor and Reynolds, his brain working overtime to catch up. Eleanor Carter. The same woman he had deliberately ignored, dismissed, and made wait for 3 hours was now shaking hands with one of the most powerful men in the company. His face lost color. Jonathan turned to Gerald, his sharp gaze slicing through the air like a blade. "Tell me, Mr. Whitman," he said, his voice calm but dangerous, "how long has Ms. Carter been waiting?" The entire bank fell silent. All eyes turned to Gerald. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. But there was no right answer, because whatever he said now wouldn't change one undeniable fact. He had made the wrong person wait. The silence inside Westwood Bank was deafening, the kind that stretched too long, that exposed things people wished had stayed hidden. Gerald Whitman stood frozen, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. His mouth opened slightly, then shut again. His brain scrambled for an answer, but there wasn't one that could save him, because Jonathan Reynolds was still waiting. The senior director's piercing gaze held steady, expecting a response. But, more than that, expecting accountability. Elena Carter, still standing between them, tilted her head slightly, watching Gerald with the patience of someone who already knew the outcome. He had played the game and lost. Ms. Carter arrived a little earlier," Gerald finally stammered, choosing his words too carefully, like a man trying to build a bridge out of thin air. Jonathan's eyes flicked toward Elena. "How long have you been waiting?" he asked directly. She glanced at her watch, then back up at him. 3 hours. A murmur rippled through the bank. One of the junior bankers nearly dropped a file. A teller subtly turned her head, trying to look busy while still listening. Even Hannah, the receptionist, had gone pale. Jonathan's jaw tightened. 3 hours, he repeated, his voice dangerously calm. The weight of those words crushed what little confidence Gerald had left. Jonathan turned back to him, his expression unreadable. "And I assume," he said slowly, "there was a very good reason for that." The air thickened. Gerald let out a nervous chuckle, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit, like the fabric was suddenly suffocating him. "Mr. Reynolds, we had several high-priority clients today, and..." Jonathan's expression didn't change. "And Ms. Carter is not a high-priority client." A flicker of panic crossed Gerald's face. "That's not what It's exactly what you meant." Jonathan's voice sliced through the air, cold and precise. Gerald's breath hitched. Elena simply watched. She didn't need to say a word. She had already won. Jonathan exhaled through his nose, as if disappointed but not surprised. He turned to Elena, ignoring Gerald entirely. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone shifting to genuine professionalism, "please, let's continue this conversation somewhere more appropriate." Elena nodded, adjusting the strap of her briefcase. And just like that, Gerald Whitman was no longer part of the equation. But as Elena and Jonathan walked past his office, she caught it, the look on Gerald's face, a realization creeping in too late. Because he wasn't just losing a client today, he was losing everything. The walls of Westwood Bank had never felt so tight. The air, once crisp and controlled, now carried a heaviness that pressed against Gerald Whitman's chest. The moment Jonathan Reynolds turned his back to him, leading Elena Carter toward the executive meeting room, it was like Gerald ceased to exist. No more forced smiles, no more arrogant smirks, no more control. His palms were damp, his heartbeat thudded against his ribs. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, not just from the executives, but from his own staff. For years he had dictated the rules in this space. For years he had decided who was worthy of urgency and who could afford to wait. But now he was the one being watched. The whispers had started, hushed but unmistakable. "Did you hear that? 3 hours? I can't believe it. She knows Reynolds personally?" This is bad for him, really bad. The words scraped against his skin like sandpaper. His phone buzzed, a sharp vibration against his desk. He glanced down. An email from corporate. His stomach twisted before he even opened it. Urgent review, customer experience concerns, immediate response required. The blood drained from his face. This wasn't just some minor slap on the wrist. This was an investigation. He gritted his teeth, his hands clenching into fists as his carefully constructed world started to fracture. Meanwhile, across the bank, inside the sleek executive meeting room, Eleanor sat comfortably in a high-backed leather chair. The contrast between where she was now and where she had been just moments ago was almost poetic. Jonathan Reynolds poured her a glass of water himself, a small but powerful gesture. "I owe you an apology," he said, settling into the chair across from her. His tone wasn't performative, it wasn't scripted, it was genuine. Elena studied him for a moment before taking a sip of water. "An apology is appreciated," she said evenly, "but I'm far more interested in what happens next." Jonathan nodded, leaning forward. "It won't be swept under the rug," he assured her. "This isn't just about a bad experience, it's about a culture that allowed it to happen in the first place. That ends today." Elena's fingers traced the rim of her glass. For 3 hours, she had been forced to sit in that lobby, being ignored, dismissed, underestimated. Now, she was the one setting the tone. And she wasn't about to waste the opportunity. "I assume Whitman will be dealt with," she said. Smoothly. It wasn't a question. Jonathan's expression darkened. His actions don't align with this institution's values. Eleanor raised a brow. And yet, they were allowed to exist within it for years. Silence stretched between them. Jonathan exhaled. "You're right." There it was. The kind of admission that most people in his position would never give. Elena let that sit for a moment before nodding. "Then let's make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Jonathan's lips pressed together, but there was something in his eyes. Respect. "Consider it done," he said. And just like that, the power had shifted permanently. Gerald Whitman's name would soon be stripped from his office door. His title, his influence, his ability to control who mattered and who didn't, gone. But Elena was just getting started. The sun had begun its slow descent over Westwood City, casting golden light through the towering glass windows of Westwood Bank. Outside, the world moved as usual. Cars honking, pedestrians rushing, life continuing without a second thought. But inside, within the pristine, climate-controlled walls of the bank, something had fundamentally changed. Elena Carter could feel it. She sat in the executive meeting room, her posture relaxed yet commanding, as Jonathan Reynolds finished sending off a message from his phone. His face was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his actions. Across the hall, behind the now closed glass door of his office, Gerald Whitman sat stiffly, his hands folded on the desk, his gaze locked onto nothing. No one approached him, no one asked for his direction. The staff had already adjusted, as if instinctively recognizing the shift in power. The man who once dictated who was seen, who was valued, who was worth respect, was now invisible. Elena glanced at Jonathan as he set his phone down. "It's done," he said simply. She arched an eyebrow. "That fast?" He let out a humorless chuckle. "When the evidence is this clear, it doesn't take long." The implications were unmistakable. Gerald Whitman was finished. Elena exhaled, her fingers lightly tapping against the polished surface of the table. "You know," she said after a moment, her tone almost conversational. The saddest part isn't even what happened to me today." Jonathan leaned forward, listening. "The saddest part," she continued, "is how normal it all was for him, how comfortable he was dismissing me. Because he knew," she let the words settle, "that he could get away with it." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Not anymore," he said. Elena tilted her head slightly, watching him. "Are you sure?" Jonathan didn't look away. "He's being placed on immediate leave while we conduct a formal review. But let's be honest." He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "There's no coming back from this." A silence stretched between them. For Elena, this moment wasn't just about Gerald Whitman. It was about all the Gerald Whitmans she had met in her lifetime. The ones who smirked, who delayed, who dismissed, who wielded power not through competence, but through the unspoken certainty that no one would challenge them. This wasn't about one man losing his job. It was about a lesson finally being taught. Jonathan leaned back slightly, studying her. "You're not just any client, are you?" he asked. It wasn't an accusation, more of an observation. Elena smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "No," she admitted, "I never was." And with that, she stood. Jonathan rose with her, offering a hand. She shook it firmly, an agreement, an unspoken understanding. As she walked toward the door, she didn't need to look back to know what she would see. Gerald Whitman, still sitting at his desk, his world unraveling. This time, he was the one waiting. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting an amber glow over the Westwood Bank lobby. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Horns honking, people rushing, the distant chatter of conversations intertwining. But inside, where time had once seemed to crawl, a quiet shift had settled in. Elena Carter stepped out of the executive meeting room, her posture unwavering, her expression unreadable. She had come here for a simple banking matter, but she was leaving with something far greater. A reckoning had taken place within these walls. The same people who had ignored her, overlooked her, underestimated her now moved differently. Their glances lingered, their voices hushed. The weight of the last few hours hung in the air like a lesson etched into the very foundation of the building. And at the center of it all, Gerald Whitman. He still sat in his glass-walled office, his once imposing figure now shrunken under the fluorescent lights. The man who had smirked, who had dismissed, who had treated her time as worthless, was now frozen in the wake of his own downfall. His phone lay on the desk, an ominous screen filled with unread messages, urgent emails, and a formal summons from corporate. His hands, once so steady in wielding silent authority, trembled slightly as he reached for the device. He didn't check the messages. He already knew what they said. Elena walked past his office, her heels clicking against the marble floor, a sound that, just hours ago, had been nothing but background noise to him. Now, it was a reminder that power was never as solid as men like Gerald believed it to be, that the walls they built to keep people out could just as easily collapse around them. And they had. The receptionist, Hannah, watched Elena as she passed, her lips parting slightly as if searching for words. Elena gave her a single knowing nod, not in anger, not in triumph, just acknowledgement, because Hannah had seen everything, and maybe, just maybe, today had been a lesson for her too. As Elena approached the glass doors, she took one last deep breath, feeling the cool, air-conditioned space against her skin before stepping out into the warmth of the evening. The sunset painted streaks of deep orange and violet across the skyline. The city had not changed, but something within her had. She didn't walk away feeling victorious. There was no need for that. Dignity was not a victory. It was her constant, her foundation, her armor, And today, it had spoken louder than any confrontation ever could. What a powerful story, right? Elena didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand respect. She simply carried herself with dignity. And that was enough to expose the truth. But now let me ask you, how often do we let people decide our worth? How many times have you been overlooked, dismissed, or made to wait while others were prioritized? And more importantly, how did you respond? Did you shrink yourself? Did you accept it? Or did you stand firm, knowing that respect isn't given, it's required? This story isn't just about what happened to Elena. It's about what happens every day, in boardrooms, offices, and even in casual conversations. So tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a situation like this? What did you do? And if you could go back, would you handle it differently? Let's talk about it. Your experience matters. Your voice matters. And if you want more powerful stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another lesson in dignity, strength, and knowing your worth. Because at the end of the day, the way you carry yourself can change everything.